Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is Ukraine War Frontline update for the 18th of February 2025. This is a 5-day update, so expect some significant changes, and I would normally say expect some large swathes of land that the Russians have taken, but in the last two updates we've seen that significantly slow down. In fact, one of the updates had more blue pins than red pins, which was phenomenally significant given the context of the last 6 months or so. So let's have a look at what's been going on. We're going to start up in the Kursk sector, where the Russians have been desperately trying to push back in some places, but the Ukrainians also making some gains and also putting the North Koreans under a lot of pressure. The North Koreans were pulled back from Kursk. Then they were pulled back in because the Ukrainians did these sort of counterattacks in the area. Here we can see that up in Malaya Lochnia, north of there, we have some Ukrainian successes going up to Marievka there and Pogrebki. So some successes for the Ukrainians in that area. We also have some successes around Kozitsa and just north of Cheskaya Porechnoye there. So that is good news for the Ukrainians, but the Russians putting a lot of pressure in the west here. So we can see some successes there as according to Syriac maps. A little bit different for Andrew Perpetua that has the line still where Syriac maps has it. So it could be that Syriac maps is ahead of the curve there, or it could be that they are listening to what the MOD says and just reacting accordingly. Also some pushback south of Chekhovskaya Konopelka in the Fanasivka area, where the Ukrainians had taken sort of 4 to 5 kilometers of land. This was as they pushed through Makhnovka there in the east of the sector. The Russians, according to Syriac maps, pushing back there as well. So that would be a bit of a shame if the Ukrainians had kind of culminated in their attack in the area. Of course, question being, what were their intentions? It was kind of limited counterattack. The Ukrainians don't have the resources to be able to do massive attacks, although there are rumors that they may well attack in other places along the front line. In fact, along the border, sorry. In fact, there are claims here that the Ukrainians launched a new incursion across the Kursk border at Obukivka here. So we'll find that on the map. Okay, I've located this area now. This is Grayskull saying this. I haven't seen this repeated with the mappers that I use here, but that is in this area. So if you have the Kursk sector that we know and have seen a lot of, and then we have this area of the border that the Ukrainians still have control of until the river, the same river comes down here, and then it goes across in this direction. Then you've got Glushkovo. So this was where the Ukrainians had attacked previously up to Glushkovo. Well, if they have attacked across the border here, it looks like it's in this area. Then that is interesting because that's something they've done previously and they actually failed with. Andrew Perpetua's quite scathing of the Ukrainian attempt to get up to Glushkovo. They failed and lost quite a lot of equipment and personnel there. So that's the area that Grayskull is talking about there, but not reflected on either of those mappers. It appears that it's fairly stable in the Vovchansk area and the Lipsy area, although the Institute for the Study of War daily report says in that area that Ukrainian sources note Russians are using light vehicles like golf carts and civilian cars for transport. In fact, if we go through some of the anecdotes from the Institute for the Study of War, this is a distilled version on my website, atpgeo.com. And thanks to Bennie Pie, who put this AI summary together. Ukrainian forces are reportedly using electronic warfare systems to disrupt a significant number of Russian decoy drones. 59 out of 147 launched in a recent attack were lost, likely due to electronic warfare interference. So that's a point of note. Russian forces near Chasiv are reportedly using civilian vehicles and motorcycles to transport infantry, rather like we just heard up in Vovchansk, highlighting potential equipment shortages or adaptation to Ukrainian tactics. And that's a $1 million question, isn't it? Are they doing it because they have to, or are they doing it because there's a competitive advantage for so doing? Russian forces are reportedly using a new satellite-controlled Kukushka drone capable of flying 16 kilometers and carrying a 35-kilogram payload. So that's significant, suggesting technological adaptation to the battlefield, on the battlefield. So that's a real challenge. And Donetsk People's Republic head Denis Pushilin is using the Soviet-era DOSAAF organization to train Ukrainian civilians in occupied Donetsk for Russian military service, reminiscent of Soviet-era military patriotic programming. So that is something that has always been a worry, the use of Ukrainian civilians in occupied territories to attack Ukrainian civilians in unoccupied territories. Okay, as you can see, large scale, well, this is 5 days of advances, so, take it in the context of that time period, but some pretty large scale advances west of the Oskil River that I do find problematic, that they are gaining and gaining here, and I wonder if Ukraine are going to do anything about that or let the Russians just keep taking that. I mean, it's not massively important land, so to speak, but it is an area where the Russians are now making some of the most significant gains on the front line, in all honesty. Some small gains as well near. Well, this is interesting because this is what you've got. You got Vilshana. You got, where is it? Is it Petropavlovka? Where have you gone? All these places have disappeared. I'm sure this was called something similar. It seems to have disappeared, the name of that settlement there. Anyway, around this area, we have Grayscale reporting that Petropavlovka, there we go. Ukrainian channel reports that the Ukrainians have advanced north of Petropavlovka. So that's north, so actually that could be... Oh, there's Petropavlovka. No, I was getting it wrong. So there could be some advances for the Ukrainians just there. It's not signified by any movement on the mapping from either of these two. Actually, Andrew Perpetua has that as grey zone anyway, but Surat Maps has that definitely in control of the Russians. Well, that might not be the case at the moment. So there could be some changes there in favour of the Ukrainians. Okay, then when we come down to the area between Svatova and Crimea here on the northeastern front line, we have some small gains for the Russians in Makivka, really fairly insignificant, and a few more small gains around Yampolivka, around Terny and Torska on these big water features there to the west of Crimea. No changes on the Seversk front line, which is good news, and indeed some changes in Chasiv Yar. Bad news for the Ukrainians in the Stupochky area, because this signifies the Russians are advancing westwards, and falls in line with the idea that they're not too bothered about Chasiv Yar. They want Konstantinivka. Now, I do have some... I don't know if it starts in Prokrosk. There is talk about the Chasiv Yar area. So Zhenya, Greg Terry, and his charity partner Zhenya, who I've travelled around Ukraine with, Zhenya sent me an update on the front line from a military analyst, which I think is pretty interesting and well worth reading. It does have some stuff in Chasiv Yar. So what does this mean? This suggests that having become disappointed in the Prokrosk direction, the Russians are trying to probe new ones, including Kramatorsk, where Chasiv Yar has been holding the line since October 2023, and Konstantinivka. So Konstantinivka is there, and Kramatorsk is further up north there. Yes, they would advance at the cost of a company, 2 or even 3 per square kilometre, but the goals will still not be achieved. A waste of resources for the sake of demonstrating the ability to spend them. A kind of burning of a $100 bill on TikTok to excite underage cerebellums. But in fact, Ukrainian troops continue to hold the line, exhausting Russian reflexes and military science, not giving the ROV a single chance to put us in a disadvantageous position as of now. People far from military science simply do not understand this. We are finishing off. So that's quite upbeat, actually, saying that the Russians are exhausting themselves so much in these directions, and they've exhausted themselves in Prokrosk to the point where the Ukrainians feel, well, this analyst feels they're finishing them off. I will say this, the redeployment of Russian troops to the Kramatorsk direction may seem like a problem, but in fact, in the current conditions, this is a dispersal of resources that is beneficial to us. Let them beat their horns against a new wall, and the previous direction, which was a priority, will receive not just a respite, but perhaps not 100 more. In other words, Prokrosk could be let off the hook somewhat with the dispersal of forces from these directions up to Kramatorsk and Chasiv. The DOV or ROV is exhausted, and so the Russians are exhausted, and this is what we are using now, regardless of the fact that coprophages, I had to look this word up, so it's like coprology is a study of feces, right? So coprophagy or coprophage is consumption of feces. So basically, the people who are meeting in Saudi Arabia and Riyadh at the moment, that's how this guy sees them. They've gathered here, they're in Saudi Arabia. We cannot care about coprophages. What is more important for us is the increase of fertilizers for our land. In other words, the death of Russians, where in a bright future we will grow wheat and raise generations that will carry into future generations the glory of those who stood as a wall before the locusts. So that's how he finishes. We'll get to what he says about Prokrosk and Karakova next. So that's interesting. But the Russians are making some advances south of the T0504 highway. In Turetsk, we see some gains for the Ukrainians, pushing the Russians back as according to Andrew Perpetua. A little bit of push and shove there. That's not reflected in Surat Maps update, but it is actually in a slightly different area than has just been indicated. The claim, although that's the area I think up there that you've just seen, possibly, the Ukrainians successfully counterattacked in Novoselivske near Turetsk, says Grey Skull, and that's in this area here, which is interesting because Surat Maps has that as a gain for the Russians. Grey Skull has it a gain for the Ukrainians, with actually the Russian the Russian line being a lot further to the south there. So if we look at this map, we have Russian control just into Leonidivka, so that's there. It's a very different map to what Surat Maps has here. Anyway, moving on, we then have the Prokrosk direction, where the Russians are making some gains according to Surat Maps towards the T0504 highway as it skirts down near to the front line before shooting off to Prokrosk. That's, if true, a challenge obviously for the Ukrainians there. We have, what else do we have? Grey Skull. Yeah, we're going to get on to Pischany. So then we come over to the area around Pischany and Kotlyna, and it's interesting that Surat Maps has a real change of mapping in that area, Kotlyna particularly. Not so much in Pischany, which has the Russians taking some land back there, but losing land up along the railway line at Kotlyna. So Grey Skull, there's been a lot of talk about Pischany. Grey Skull says Ukrainian Frontline channel discusses success in Pischany. The Russians were significantly mowed down and are in panic, which doesn't fit with what Surat Maps is saying, with the Russians retaking Pischany. Okay. Prokrosk direction, there is successful work of our special units in the Pischany area, say the Ukrainians. We knocked out the PDARs, that's an insult for the Russians, from key points where they controlled our routes. Yes, we have losses, unfortunately, but the PDARs were significantly mowed down, and this is a really cool and successful operation for all this time in this direction. We do not specify the unit. The gangs are very shocked by such impudence on our part and are now in panic. In some settlements, there are also small successes. Brothers, we are working now, so far without information. So that's a really upbeat synopsis of what's going on there. Of course, take it with a pinch of salt. But actually, there seem to be a lot of claims that the Ukrainians have really been pushing the Russians back in these areas. A claim by the Surat Maps that the Russians have maybe advanced a tiny bit in Udachny, further along the railway line, though. And then as we come further... Oh, in fact, let's go to the Prokrosk direction from this military source. So the Prokrosk theme haunted the Russian generals all of 2024, and they've been planning to capture the city for the past year. Then, due to obvious changes, the advance to Prokrosk and the start of urban battles was postponed until the end beginning of 2024-2025, which is just before Donald Trump's inauguration. The city was being ground to dust, and the Russians could boast of footage of the destruction of proof of their superiority. But no, the Russian command initially planned to encircle Prokrosk, but for this, it was necessary to fulfill at least two conditions: to cut off the Kursk salient and organize a stable LBS with flanks. In other words, to cut all of the area off down south. So this is Prokrosk, to cut this down south and to flank Prokrosk. That's what they needed to do. In addition, I noted earlier that in order to encircle Prokrosk, the ROV needs to a potential of a group of at least 150,000 bodies, men, while in the entire Prokrosk-Karakova direction, there are just over 100,000 men concentrated. That is, even if all the troops are removed from the Karakova salient and concentrated in the Prokrosk direction to carry out an operation to encircle the city, there will not be enough to implement the plan. It's the second half of February 2025, and what do we find? The flanks right and left at Prokrosk are not formed. There is no elementary coverage. There is no stable LBS. The Karakova direction was never cut off. At the same time, the 55th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade of the 41st OVA lost its combat capability and was withdrawn to the second echelon for restoration and replaced by the 15th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade of the 2nd OVA, which was generally intended for urban combat in Prokrosk. But then events develop even more interestingly. While the 90th Territorial Defence is desperately fighting to capture another forest plantation at a cost of 2 to 3 companies on the Karakova salient, the ROV command has made interesting decisions, namely to transfer the 8th OVA consisting of the 20th MSD and the 150th MSD to the north, or more precisely to bypass Konstantinivka, and that's what we were talking about earlier, from the west. In other words, it is 12 kilometers from the Turetsk agglomeration and more than 22 kilometers from Keremik. That is, logically, a quick breakthrough is not expected. And what does it mean? And then he went on to explain that. So it appears. So the general claim from this person, again, pinch of salt, is that they failed to flank Prokrosk and stabilize these flanks. They failed to do as much as they wanted to do in the Karakova direction, and they've taken the troops from this area and put them up north to Konstantinivka and Kramatorsk direction. And you need, even if you had all those troops remaining there and plied them into Prokrosk area in a concentrated fashion, it still wouldn't be enough to take Prokrosk, is the claim. And so, you know, you can say that, yeah, the Russians have been taking land consistently, but they haven't actually done a very good job of it. They haven't done enough. Decisions have been pretty poor, and they're not in a great position right now to take much more land, and particularly take Prokrosk. All of which is very, very interesting. So as we come south of Prokrosk, we see that, yep, some more gains for the Russians along that line around the Srebnya settlement and Zaporizhzhia. And then that's the actual village, not the oblast area, which we were talking about the other day. We see some wide-scale successes for the Russians in the Ulakli area around Kostiantynopil. It could be that the Ukrainians are finally pulling out of there as the Russians are closing the neck of that cauldron. I hope that there are no Ukrainians caught in that sector and trapped. That was one of the worries. But yeah, according to at least Syriac maps, the Russians have largely taken that area to the west of Dachny and indeed Karakova. So that is a real shame for the Ukrainians there. And they are making some fairly consistent gains, particularly to the west of Velika Novoselivske. But this has been painful for the Russians as well, taking significant losses too, as they do in a number of places on the front line. Interesting, there are a couple of gains for the Ukrainians according to Syriac maps, and it could just be rejigging of the mapping, or it could be counterattacks south of Novodanilivka there, along the Zaporizhzhia front line towards the reservoir, and indeed around the Kamyansk area where the Ukrainians have been having some success of late, moving the Russians down to from a tree line and south in some of the fields there. Nothing too significant at all, really, but shows that the Ukrainians are possibly still pressuring, or it could be remapping some rejigs and whatnot. Interesting times at the moment in terms of the mapping and the front line. Some fairly, I guess, positive sounds coming from some Ukrainian analysts and sources, but the Russians are still pressing on. Of course, they are. How long can they do this? How much damage are they doing to their military capability by continuing these moves? I don't know. There are a lot of Russians still very active. They have huge armed forces, of course, because they've been recruiting so hugely from a number of places, prisons and all over the shop, really. But these aren't the greatest troops that are coming in. They do have experienced troops doing good things as far as the Russians are concerned on the front line, but they also have an awful lot of pretty dire looking troops, poorly trained, poorly equipped, and often with injuries as well. So there's a real mix on the front line. That's not to underestimate the Russians. And of course, they are still innovating and adapting to frontline needs. So it's very difficult for the Ukrainians, but they have done, I think, a pretty amazing job to contain the Russians without doing a full mobilization themselves. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how the next couple of weeks pan out. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Take care, and I will speak to you pretty soon, no doubt.